Hey, I'm Blow Up the Noobs, and I hijacked this channel to show you a tutorial on how to procedurally place objects in a grid. But first, I'd like to thank the Golden Devs for allowing me to put this tutorial on his channel, and for helping me make it. Also, please note that what I'm about to show you piggybacks on part of Taro Dev's tutorial. And because I don't want to steal views, why don't you visit his video until the time on screen. Alright, now that we got that out of the way, let's actually start the tutorial. The first thing we need to take care of right now is having a database of sorts to store the tiles, so we can keep tabs on all the potential spaces, and to be able to tell if the tile we're trying to put the obstacle on is already occupied by another one. My solution to the first problem is to put all the tiles into a list. However, to make the tile system easier to work with, I'm going to put a list in a list as shown. And as to why it is easier to work with, I'll display when we start putting the tiles into the list. To begin said process, every time we make a new row of tiles, we need to make a new list of game objects in the tiles. So within the generate grid function inside the x's for loop, we will write tiles.add new list game object, and where it actually creates the tiles, I'm going to set the instantiated tile to a temporary variable called new tile, and then write tilesx.addNewTile in the following line. And because I like to keep my hierarchy from getting cluttered, I'm also going to set the parent of the tiles to the tile manager. Now, just to make sure that it works, we can always use a debug.log, putting in a random point that should be in there. Now that we made sure it's working, it's time to make the tables able to tell the tile manager if the space is occupied by an obstacle. Go into the tile prefabs in the asset menu, and then add a script to it. In my case, I will call it tile script. Inside the script now, we will need to make it a new variable, which I will call occupied. As for the rest of the stuff in the script, it's all pointless, so feel free to delete it. Now that we did that, we can actually start generating the obstacles. Under the generate grid function, I'm going to create another function that I'll call generate obstacles. Before we start developing the function, however, we're going to take in the amount of generations we want to make and the obstacle type that we wish to spawn. So I'm going to add int spawns and game object obstacles into the parentheses of the function. First thing we need to do in the function is repeat the spawn every single time we wish to spawn the obstacle. So we need something to make a for loop inserting int I as 0 for int I is less than spawns I++, so that way it'll stop spawning after it spawns all the obstacles we want it to. Inside the loop, we can now put the code to actually create the variables. First off, we'll need to get random coordinates inside the tile space. So I'm going to create an x and a y variable, and set them to random.range, 0 minus width, and height, respectively. Since they carry the highest possible values they could go to, once the variables have been assigned, so that way we don't end up putting a bunch of obstacles on the same spots, we just need to write a simple if statement to check if the spot has already been occupied, stating if tiles.getComponent tile script is not occupied. If the spot hasn't been occupied, then we just need to instantiate it on the coordinates that we generated, and then occupy the space. And simply because I like to clean up the hierarchy, I'm also going to parent these tiles. Now that we have the obstacles spawning, maybe we don't want to have obstacles giving up on spawning whenever they attempt to go into an empty space. For this, I'm going to create a new variable called shoots. After the spawns loop, I will create a new loop for the shoots, which will need to put all the other code inside of this. Normally, I would have made an if statement checking if it found the spot already, but recently I learned a more optimal way, where you can just put the break tag inside the if statement, checking if the spot is taken right at the end. Now that we have all that done, I'll just create a tree prefab real quick, with the dimensions 1 by 1. Now we'll give the grid manager a reference to the prefab. and call the generate obstacle function with the tree prefab, and say 50 tiles in my grid inside the start function. Going back to Unity, we press play, and it should randomly generate all 50 tiles, which I don't wish to count right now. Now that we did that though, what if we wanted to generate bigger objects? To accomplish this, we will end up doing most of the same things we did in the single tile obstacle generation, so I'll copy and paste the function right under it. First of all, we need to get the size of the objects. I'd recommend just adding an extra parameter to the beginning of the function over here, but for the sake of the tutorial, I'm just going to grab the scale of the prefab that I'm going to spawn, which will require me to switch the name of the function, because it'll have two parameters like the first one. Now that we have the size figured out, we should actually start changing the contents of the function. Because it is bigger than one tile, spawning on some of the tiles near the edge could make it go off the edge, which we don't want it to happen. So for the width, we subtract size.x to keep it within the range, and for height, we'll subtract size.y. Now the objects will once again only spawn inside our generated area. The next step is to make it scan every tile that it would spawn on, which is rather simple. We just need to make a double for loop. It doesn't matter the order, but I'm going to write int a is less than size.x, and in the other, b, for less than size.y. Before the for loops, I'm going to introduce a new boolean called tiles unoccupied, and I'll set it to true. Now, inside the for loop, if any of the tiles are occupied, then we'll set it to false. Once all the tiles have been checked and there are no occupied spaces, we'll then let it run the instantiation part of the code. Next, we need to simply go back to all the tiles and set their status to occupied, so we can just copy the part that scans them and replace the if statement with a piece of code to make the spaces count as occupied. Now, real quick, I'm going to add our new big obstacle generation right before our tree generation, which I will make a new game object variable in prefab for. If we run the code a few times, pretty quickly you should notice a problem with our generation. They're appearing over spaces that they shouldn't. The reason for that is actually rather simple. The center is over the bottom left corner of the occupied tiles instead of the center of them. The fix would be to go into the code and make the spawning position account for the size of the object and change the location of it accordingly. Note that the center of our object is actually half the size of it, so we'll need to divide it by 2 to get the right calculations. Otherwise, we'd just be putting it on the opposite corner. In the instantiation code, I'll just add half the width and height to the spawn coordinates. Subtract it by 1 because the starting position is inside the bottom right corner, and it should work now. Next step would be to procedurally generate the ground. But because I need views, and subs, on my channel as well, and as much as I personally hate seeing people do this, the next part is going to be on my channel, which should be linked somewhere in the video, the description, or maybe on the screen if it works between channels.